Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. As you guys saw by the community post, this is a review that, for whatever reason, has been taking forever to upload. So I just decided to delete the video, and I'm gonna try to make the video shorter, see if maybe that's the problem. But anyway, and hopefully this is the last time I have to record the review, which would only be my second time, but still. But anyways, guys, this is Cole, and today's movie I'm going to be reviewing is the 1987 drama movie Over the Top, starring Sylvester Stallone. And this is a movie that I've always enjoyed, but you might be asking, well, what's this movie about for those who don't know? Well, the premise of this movie is as follows. Lincoln Hawk, a struggling truck driver, tries to reconnect with his estranged son, Michael, while competing in World Arm Wrestling Championship in Las Vegas. Hawk seems to win a $100,000 prize. He seeks to win a $100,000 prize and a new truck to start his own company while battling his wealthy father-in-law for custody. So that's basically the plot synopsis to this movie, and overall, this is a movie that I think is really good. And, well, how was this movie received when it came out? Well, at this point, Sylvester Stallone was pretty much at the top of his career with Rocky and Rambo, and specifically Rocky in particular, because the original Rocky came out in 1976, and it was a very well-received movie, both critically by both critics and audiences, and it was a big hit at the box office. And Stallone even won an Oscar for Best Actor for that movie. And then, of course, he did Rambo, which was a big hit, so he was pretty much on top of it. But when this movie was released in 1987, it bombed at the box office, only making $16 million worldwide on a $25 million budget. However, over the years, the movie has gained a massive cult following, and it sold a lot better on DVD and VHS tape. Now, as for my reaction to the movie, I think that this is a rather good movie, and honestly, one of Sylvester Stallone's best movies. But without further ado, let's get into my review. The movie starts off with our main character, Lincoln Hawk, played by Sylvester Stallone, driving a large truck with a metal hawk ornament attached to the front hood of the car. Well, the truck. We then cut to a scene at a military school and with a kid named Michael, who's doing an instructed military march. And while this is going on, we cut to a scene where Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, is cleaning his truck and the metal hawk ornament. The military class is dismissed shortly after, and Michael sees a bunch of parents visiting their children. And not long after that, we cut to our main character, Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, who asks a guard at the gate if he can pick up his son Michael, and which the guard does approve of. And Michael is about to take off in a limousine until one of his friends says, "The colonel wants to see you right away." And then Michael says, "Yes, sir." Then Michael does as he's told, and we cut to a scene where Lincoln is in the office and the police chief says, "Your father has come here to take you home." And then Lincoln says, "Hello, Mike." And then Michael says, "I don't have a father, sir." And then the general says, "This is your father, Michael." And then Michael says, my grandfather has instructed me to go home with no one besides himself or my mother." And the general then says, "Your mother has legal custody over you, not your grandfather. And it is her request that your father bring you home." And then Michael and his dad, Lincoln, not long after they're told that, basically walk outside of the building. Well, the colonel was the guy who basically told Michael that. But anyways, we cut to a scene where Michael and his dad, Lincoln, walk out the building. And then Michael sees Lincoln's truck and he says, "Are we really going into this? Why can't we fly?" And then Lincoln says, your mother thought it would be a good way for us to get to know each other." And then Michael says, how long will it take? And then the character Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, says, well, I have one more pickup in, say, 2 or 3 days. We'll be in California, and your mother doesn't go into surgery, say, until Wednesday morning. And then his son, Michael, says, do you really think you can make up 10 years in 2 to 3 days? And then Lincoln says, no. And then not long after that, Michael gets into the truck. And then Michael says, I'd like to say something, sir. And then Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, says, sure. And then Michael says, this truck is disgusting. And then Lincoln says, and then after he drops that insult, Lincoln says, I don't know, Mike. It's just old. Once in a stretch up to Vegas, this thing got up to. And then Michael says, sir, there's no need to make conversation for my sake. And then Lincoln says, so much for small talk. And I will say, Michael does come across as a little disrespectful at the beginning of this movie. However, throughout the course of the movie, he does change, and he does start to like his dad, Lincoln. And he is a jerk in this movie at first, but it is one of the few rare times where it actually works, because with this movie, it actually makes sense why Michael is this way. And again, he does become better as a character. So this is one of the few times where I can let it slide in a movie. And then, for example, early on in the movie, Michael says, I'm feeling sick. Can you pull over? And then Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, says yes. However, Michael was lying to his dad, and he tries to run away, and he goes into the road with a lot of dangerous traffic, and Lincoln runs after him and saves him from a car. But Michael pushes him off and goes into the road with a lot of dangerous traffic. So Lincoln runs after him and saves him from a car, but Michael pushes him off and runs with Lincoln chasing him. And then Lincoln grabs Michael and says, Mike, stop it, stop it, stop it. And then Michael cries and yells, I hate you. And then Lincoln says, then hate me. We have to start someplace. So then him and Lincoln walk back to the truck. We are then introduced to a character by the name of Jason and his men. And Jason, Cutler, Jason Cutler, and his men. And Jason Cutler is Michael's father-in-law. And he storms to the colonel's office, and the colonel says, the mother's boy called, Mr. Cutler. She insisted that Michael leave with his father. And then Cutler says, don't you understand? My daughter is in no condition to make that kind of decision. I didn't fly all the way up here to be simply told you turned my grandson over to that worthless person. I cannot tolerate stupidity. I'll bring this to the attention of the board. We then cut to a scene with Lincoln and Michael, and Michael is upset at his dad, and after Michael throws an insult at Lincoln, I like the part when Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, says, you're just full of good humor, aren't you, Mike? And then he said, and he suggested going to a restaurant, and his son was against that idea. But then, Sylvester Stallone, after his character, Lincoln Hawk, after he talks to his son, says, why don't we just try it anyway, huh? And then we cut to a scene where Lincoln and Michael are sitting down at the bar, and the bartender says, hey, Link, how are you? And then Lincoln says, good. Hi, Martha, this is my kid, Mike. And then Martha says, how are you doing? And then Mike says, good. How about you? How do you do, ma'am? And then Martha says, ma'am, whoo, I like it. And then Martha says, so what will it be? A couple of big steaks? And then Lincoln says, for me. Mike will have chicken. And then Mike says, no, excuse me. And then Mike basically proceeds to give off a nutritional fact, and basically, so he doesn't want the food that was suggested. And the bartender says, so what do you want? And then Michael says, I will have tuna salad, whole wheat toast, and spring water with lemon, please. And then Lincoln says, double that. And then Mike smiles, and then Lincoln says to his son, if you want, we can go to McDonald's or something. And then, right after that, a tall, muscular man walks up and says, you Hawk? And then Lincoln says, what can I do for you? The man says, I'm the Smasher. And then Lincoln says, that's a nice name, obviously sarcastically. And then he makes a bet for $1,000. And then the Smasher makes a bet that for $1,000 he can tear Lincoln's arm off in an arm wrestling match, and Lincoln decides to be brave enough to take on that offer. Then, about 15 minutes into the movie, Lincoln walks into a room full of loud people and the Smasher with his arm on the table ready for the arm wrestling match. We then cut to Michael sitting down, and a tall, muscular person named Bull Hurley, played by wrestler Rick Zumwalt, the main villain of the movie, says, "What are you doing with that guy?" And then Mike says, "He's my father." And then Bull says, "Too bad." We then finally get to the first arm wrestling match of the movie in a very epic scene where Lincoln is struggling due to the Smasher's very strong arm, but then after being cheered on is able to beat the Smasher in the arm wrestling match, and Lincoln himself, played by Sylvester Stallone, wins $1,000. And the main bad guy of the movie, Bull, basically wants to do an arm wrestling match, and then Lincoln says, "Not right now, we'll do it in Vegas." And then he gives a grin, and the main bad guy, Bull, says, "See you in Vegas." And anyways, we now cut to a scene in the movie where Michael is on the phone with his mom saying, "I don't even know him. I don't want to be with him." And then Michael's mom says, You have to try for me. He's your father." Michael, there is so much more to life than what you have seen. I have to go now, but first, I want to talk to your father. Michael gives Lincoln the phone, and then Lincoln says to his wife, Andrea, he says, "How are you?" "Yeah, we're having a great time." "Yeah, he's very helpful. As a matter of fact, he's helping me right now." And then we cut to a scene where Lincoln is then in the truck driving, and Michael says, "Are you still dealing drugs?" because his dad basically told him a lie. And then Lincoln says to his son, "I did not do what your grandpa says I did. The only mistake I ever made was leaving you. That I admit." Lincoln, played by Sylvester Stallone, then says, "How did you like the arm wrestling match?" And then Michael says, "It's an experience." And then Lincoln says, "It sure is." And then and then I like the part where he puts a song on the radio that Mike turns off because he doesn't like the music, and then him and Stallone he turns it on, he turns it on, his son turns it off, and then they keep doing it, and then he's like, "Mike, I think you're wearing out the radio." And then great humor. And one thing I will say is that this movie's got a really good cast. You got Sylvester Stallone as the main character, Lincoln Hawk, who's easily the standout. You got David Mendenhall as the kid Michael. You got Susan Blakely as Christina Hawk. You got Robert Loggia as Jason Cutler, and John Brandon as Colonel Davis, and Rick Zumwalt as Bill Hurley, who all give great performances. And you can definitely tell that Lincoln cares for his son, Michael, which, is ironic because Sylvester Stallone actually did have a son in real life by the name of Sage Stallone, who died at the age of 36 in 2012. And Sage Stallone was in the 1996 movie Daylight with Sylvester Stallone, which I actually do rather like that movie. And I own it on Blu-ray. I would like to review Daylight at some point. But anyways, back onto the review. That's another video for another day. Needless to say, Jason Cutler is not happy that Christina Hawk let her husband pick up her son Michael, and he wants to get his son-in-law Mike back. And our character of the movie, Lincoln Hawk, played by Sylvester Stallone, could not find a hotel, so he suggests that him and Michael sleep in the truck for the night, and Mike says, if you can do it, I can do it. And then Lincoln says, "That's the spirit. Good night, son." Mike then says, "Good night, sir." And then Lincoln says, "I think we'll get along tonight. You're a good kid." And then the next morning, they wake up and they basically arm wrestle for practice, building up strength. And then they drive on the road, still on the way to Vegas. And Lincoln says, "Mike, it's great driving with such a tremendous intellectual like you. It's a real blessing." And then Mike smiles, and once again, you can tell that him and Lincoln are starting to get along with each other. And I do like the scene where Lincoln is trying to teach his son Michael how to drive the truck. And that right there is a great father and son bonding scene. Then Lincoln and his kid Michael go to the arcade, and Lincoln basically asks a kid if him and any of his friends ever arm wrestled, and then the kid says why. Um, and the kid's name is Archie, and then Sylvester Stallone's character Lincoln says, "I have a kid here who thinks he can beat you, any one of you guys, 2 out of 3 times," and he says, "In fact, I'm willing to put money on it." And then and so Mike decides to go do it, and Mike fails at it, and he runs outside, crying at the fact that he lost. And then Lincoln says to him, "I know you can He says, "Look, I'm sorry you lost." He's like, "Look, I know you can do it. You only lost because you let yourself lose." And he says, "I love you. You're my son. You're my boy. But you're also a spoiled rich brat that has had everything done for him. But you are a spoiled rich brat that has had everything done for you. It's time to do it for yourself, and you can do it. I am telling you, the world meets nobody halfway. Do you understand that? If you want it, Mike, you gotta take it. All I care about is you. Go in there and try. I know you can win, but even if you don't, so what? You lose. As long as you lose like a winner, it doesn't matter because you did it with dignity. I am telling you, if you don't go in there, you will be sorry. You will be regretting it your whole life. You know what I mean? Go on. I know you can do it. Will you do it for me?" And then Michael says he'll do it. So then we cut to a scene where Michael does an arm wrestling match against Richie, and he has faith that he can win. And basically, he has faith he can win, and he does beat Richie in an arm wrestling match. And after Lincoln cheers him on, he says, but because he beat him the first time, he has to wrestle him a second time. And, there's a scene where, Lincoln is cheering on his son. He's cheering on his son, Michael, and he says, "You got him. Come on, Mike. Over the top, Mike. Over the top." And then Mike beats him again. And then Richie pays up. And then after he had to, and Richie says, "How did he do that?" And then Michael says, "Good genetics." And then Michael is so proud and happy, and he talks to his mom on the phone and tells her what he did. And his mom is in the hospital bed, and she does sound weak because she's has a disease going on. And the mother basically says on the phone to her son, "I am so proud of you. I want to talk to your dad, okay? I love you." And then Lincoln says, "Hi, honey. Oh, yeah, it was a great idea. He and I spending time like this together." Lincoln's wife then says, "I hope so. I know it won't be easy, Link. Whatever happens, I want you to stay with him. I know how difficult it is for you, but it's really important. He needs you, honey. Please try to make things work between me and my father." Lincoln then makes a promise saying that he will. The mother, Christina Hawk, then says, "I cannot wait to see you two." And then Lincoln says to his wife on the phone, "He's a great kid, and I'll see you soon, okay?" But not long after Lincoln hangs up the phone, he sees that 2 people kidnap Michael against his will, 2 people that Jason Cutler hired to kidnap him, and basically these people are putting Michael into a truck. And then Sylvester Stallone's character Lincoln, he tries to run after his son, but someone attacks him, pushing him to the ground. But Lincoln is able to punch the guy down, one of the bad guys, down to the ground, and Lincoln gets into the truck, chasing down the 2 bad guys who kidnapped Michael, and he basically crashes into the back of the bad guy's truck. And they end up running away, and Michael is safe. And then Lincoln yells at them, "He's staying with me. You tell him that. You tell him." So Jason Cutler is obviously not going to be happy at this, but we'll get to that later. And Lincoln basically ask Michael if he's okay, and Michael says yes. And so because of that, Lincoln and Michael go to the hospital to visit Michael's mom, or Lincoln's wife. And a doctor basically informs Lincoln that his wife died due to failure of heart surgery. And then Michael cries, basically running outside of the building, blaming his father. And he says, if you would have never shown up, I would have seen her." And then Lincoln basically says, "Nobody knew, Mike." And then Mike is obviously not thinking because his sadness is overtaking him, and he basically sees that there's a taxi, and he yells taxi, and he says, "Take me to the Cutler estate. I am going home." And Lincoln tries to chase after him, but it's no use. Then, the next day, Lincoln goes to the funeral and puts flowers by the grave, and then Michael is crying, and he still blames Lincoln even though he doesn't say it. And later that night, Lincoln goes to the Cutler estate, and he says to the bodyguard he wants to talk to Jason Cutler. The bodyguard says, "You're not welcome here." And then Lincoln says, "Would you tell him Lincoln Hawk would like to talk to him?" And then the bodyguard says, and then Lincoln says, and the bodyguard says, "Like I said, you're not wanted here." And then Lincoln says, "I want to see my boy." And then the bodyguard says, "Move, get this thing out of here before I call the police." And the Cutler estate is basically a giant mansion guarded by a fenced up metal gate. And then Lincoln decides to walk away. He backs up his truck out of sight, and then he rams his truck through, basically not breaking the gate down. And he busts down the mansion door, and he walks inside to go get his son. And obviously, Jason Cutler is furious, and he says, "What have you done?" And then Lincoln says, "Mike, come with me, please." And then Jason Cutler says, "You think you can get away with this? Come into my home, destroy my place, and take Michael with you? Michael is my boy. You deserted him years ago, and that is a fact that you cannot change no matter what you do. Darn you." Then not long after that, the two bodyguards tackle Lincoln to the ground, and then Michael yells, Dad, please let him go." But Jason pulls Michael away and tells him to go to his room. And then the cops arrive, arresting Lincoln, and Michael cries seeing his dad go to jail, with Jason Cutler basically patting him on the back, which, yeah, I do not like this character at all, to say the least. Anyways, the next day, Lincoln decides to go visit his dad in jail, and basically he says, "You can come with me, son." And then basically the son says, "I can't go with you. I'm sorry." And then Lincoln sighs and says, "I understand." Plus, Jason's lawyer is present, so that especially doesn't help. So then Lincoln decides to drive to Nevada to have his truck fixed. Michael then sneaks out envelopes out of a bag, and he sees the letters that Lincoln wrote for him, because earlier in the movie, Lincoln told him that he wrote letters, but Michael never got the letters, but that's because his grandpa always stole them. But Michael finds out about this, so then he decides to sneak out of the house, basically by driving a truck away. So because of that, he wants to go see his dad. And I gotta say, the scene where Lincoln Park, played by Sylvester Stallone, is taking out people in arm wrestling matches is great. And then later, Jason Cutler says to Lincoln, "I see you lost your first match. Here's $500,000 and a free truck. Now get out of my life. Start a new life. Make a new family." Lincoln then says, "I already have a family, and when this is over, I am getting him." And Lincoln tries to leave, but Jason's bodyguard says, "Look at Cutler when he is talking to you." And then Jason says, "I am through." And then Lincoln says, "I am through with talking." And after the bodyguard pushes him back, Lincoln punches the bodyguard through the glass door. He then walks back to the tournament, and Mike is on his way to watch and support his dad. Michael is cheering on his dad, but one of Jason Cutler's bodyguards shows up. However, Michael is able to escape. And then Michael is able to sneak underneath some bleachers where he sees his dad, not long after he was done with a match. And Michael says, "Dad," in excitement. And then Lincoln says, "What are you doing here?" And then Michael says, "It's a long story, but I want to stay with you." And then Lincoln says, "That's great, but I do not think your grandpa is going to let that happen." Michael says, "But I want to be with you, Dad." And then Lincoln says, "I want to be with you too, Mike, but I don't have any money. I sold the truck." And then Mike says, "That's okay. You're going to win like you said, remember?" And then Lincoln says, "Mike, in this last match, I think I pulled a little too hard. This guy I'm going up against, Bull Hurley, he has not lost a single match in 5 years. I don't know. He's good, Mike. And then Michael, I'm just going to call him Mike because that's what even though I know his name is Michael, I'm just going to call him Mike because that's what Lincoln calls him. Mike says, "It doesn't matter to me if you win or lose, Dad. All I care about is being with you, Dad. I love you." And then Lincoln says, "I love you too, Mike." And then we get the scene we've all been waiting for. We get the epic arm wrestling scene between Lincoln and the main villain of the movie, Bull Hurley. And then Mike yells, "Come on, Dad, take him. Come on, take him on, Dad. Over the top, Dad, over the top." And I gotta say, this is a very intense wrestling scene. And when it seems like Lincoln will lose, he does gain the strength to overtake Bull, and he does successfully beat the main villain in an arm wrestling match, winning $100,000. And Mike holds the trophy, proud of his dad, with Jason Cutler, who arrived, watching and shedding a small tear. And then our movie ends where it is revealed that, like I said, he won a new truck because of the money with a metal hawk ornament on it. And Mike says, "Why don't we start our own trucking company? We should call it Sun and Hawk." And then Lincoln says, "That's not too bad, but how do you think Hawk and Sun sounds?" And then Mike says, "Hey, it might just work." And then Lincoln says, "Come on." And then him and his son happily drive off. And so, yeah, that's the end of the movie. At the end of the day, this is a great movie, easily one of my favorite Sylvester Stallone movies. I would definitely recommend this if you're a huge Stallone fan. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Over the Top a 9 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review. Thanks for watching, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye now. And I really should tackle some more Sylvester Stallone movies at some point, but that'll be it for now.